everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I'm sharing 15 of my Patriotic Decor DIYs that I've shared so far here on my channel. Keep in mind that they will be labeled out of order since this is a combination of all of my projects put together into one video. I hope that you enjoy today's projects. Now let's get right into it. For DIY number 1, I'm making an America sign. For this project, I used a 24-inch by 5.5-inch by 3/4 inch thick piece of wood that I got from Lowe's, 2 3-inch unfinished wood stars, wood letters that spell out the word America, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, bulk art chalk paint in Tuscan red and also in nautical, Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown, paintbrushes, cotton cord from Hobby Lobby, and my hot glue gun. I started by painting this wood piece with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. I did do 2 different coats of paint so that I could get that natural wood color all covered up. Once that paint was all dry, I then started just dressing my wood with 120 grit sandpaper, and after doing it for a while it really wasn't working out so well, so I ended up switching to a 60 grit piece of sandpaper, and that ended up scratching the wood exactly how I wanted it to. Next, I'm applying some of this stain using an old towel. I'm not applying the stain over top of the entire board. I'm just randomly wiping it on the board in places that I want it to look really distressed. And I still want some of that white color of the board to pop through as well. I'm using this water-based stain, which is something that I've just discovered, and I really love it because it doesn't have all of those toxic chemical smells that your average stain would have. Now I'm painting both of my 3-inch unfinished wood stars with my paint in the color Tuscan red. I'm not exactly sure where these stars are from. I think they're from either Walmart or Hobby Lobby. I've had them in my craft stash for quite a while, but both of those stores carry unfinished wood stars. Then I'm painting all of my unfinished wood letters that spell out the word America with my folk art chalk paint in the color nautical, and I only did 1 coat of paint on all of the letters. After all of the paint has dried on my stars and all of my letters, I'm then taking a piece of 120 grit sandpaper and I'm sanding over all of them. I want each one of these pieces to have a really rustic look. I'm now cutting 2 pieces of this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, long enough so that I can wrap them around the top and the bottom of this board. Then I'm wrapping one of the pieces 2 inches down from the very top corner of the board, and then I'm hot gluing the ends of that burlap ribbon along the back side. Next, I'm cutting 2 pieces of this cotton cord long enough so that I can wrap these around the front of the board as well. Then to attach the cords, I'm placing some hot glue in the center of my burlap ribbon along the front side of my board, then wrapping them around to the back side and hot gluing the 2 ends of the cord down. I'm attaching my star by using some hot glue along the back side and then pressing the star on top of the burlap ribbon and the cord that I've already attached to my board. Then for the bottom of my board, I'm measuring 2 inches up and placing that burlap ribbon that I've already pre-cut. I'm doing the same thing as I did for the top of the board. I'm taking that burlap ribbon, wrapping it around the front of the board, and then attaching the 2 ends of that ribbon along the back side using hot glue, and then using this cotton cord the same as I did the very top. Once I have those cut, I'm just hot gluing them over top of that burlap ribbon right in the center. Then for my second star, I'm attaching it on the bottom of my board over top of the burlap ribbon and cotton cord. Next, I'm placing all of my wood letters in the center of my wood board so I can have them exactly where I want them before I start gluing all of them down. To attach my letters, I'm placing hot glue along the back side of each letter and then pressing them down in the same spot where I'd already laid them out, and I'm continuing this step until I have all of the letters attached. Here is my America sign all finished. I love the rustic look of this sign, and it was really easy and inexpensive to make. I know that I'll be using this piece for years to come. Now moving on into DIY number 2, I'll be making a USA rag wreath. For this project, I used a 5x7 frame from Dollar Tree, large popsicle sticks, the inside ring of a 3-inch embroidery hoop, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, folk art chalk paint in nautical and also in the color Java, paintbrushes, this checked fabric from Hobby Lobby, burlap fabric also from Hobby Lobby, alphabet stamps and ink pad, jute, and my hot glue gun. I started by taking my 5x7 frame apart. This frame actually had the glass broken out of it, and I'm not going to be using the glass part of the frame, so it worked perfect for this project. Once I had it taken apart, I started painting it with my Waverly chalk paint in plaster. I did do 2 different coats of this paint so that I could get that underneath wood color all covered up. After those coats of paint were all dry, I then went in with my Dollar Tree stencil brush and my Java colored chalk paint, and I dry brushed that over top of my entire frame so that it would have more of a rustic farmhouse look. Next, I'm painting 5 large popsicle sticks that I picked up from Dollar Tree with my plastered colored paint, and I only had to do 1 coat of paint for these. I'm then painting 5 more of these large popsicle sticks, only this time I'm painting them with my nautical colored paint, and I only did 1 coat on these as well. Once all of my paint has dried, I then took a piece of 120 grit sandpaper and I sanded over all 10 of my popsicle sticks. I want them to have a rustic look just like my frame. Now I'm assembling the background for my frame and putting hot glue on the 2 ends of the first popsicle stick, which is the blue one, and then I'm placing it along the back side of the frame. And then I decided it was a little bit easier to just place the glue right on top of the sides of the frame. So I'm doing that, just placing glue on each side and then pressing the popsicle stick over top of the glue to attach it. And I did switch up in between the colors of the popsicle sticks. I did blue, white, blue, white, blue, white, blue, white until I had all 10 of them attached to the back of the frame. Next, I'm cutting my fabric in strips to make my wreath. The strips I'm cutting are about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick, and I wasn't being real precise. Some of them were thicker than others, but again, this whole project is going to have a rustic look to it, and I knew that by having them a few different sizes really wasn't going to matter. Once I had this color fabric all cut, then I moved on to my burlap fabric, and I cut that the same way, about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick, and some of them again were bigger than others, but it really didn't matter. To make my wreath, I'm using the inside of a 3-inch embroidery hoop, and I just wrapped my fabric right around the ring and then tied it in a knot. I started with my checked fabric and then I did the burlap fabric after that, and I just rotated between the two. I did the checked, the burlap, the checked, the burlap, and I just continued that step until I had my entire ring wrapped with the fabric. Now, you could use a floral ring or pretty much any kind of ring that you had. This is just one that I had left over in my stash. The ends of my fabric strips were a little bit long once I had them wrapped around my ring, so I just cut them down a little bit so that it would fit better when I attach it to my frame. I decided I wanted to have a popsicle stick going along the back of my wreath, and to make it look rustic, I'm using some of this Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown, and I'm applying it with an old towel. Once that dried, I then took my plastered color paint and I dry brushed that over top of the stain. I then measured the popsicle stick along the back of my wreath and then used some scissors to cut down the excess wood on each side. I'm putting hot glue on the back side of that popsicle stick and then attaching it in the center of my frame. I wanted to have the letters USA on that piece of popsicle stick that I had attached in the middle, so I just placed my wreath over top so I knew exactly where to center it, and then I stamped on the letters USA right in the center. To fully attach my wreath, I tied a piece of jute around the top ring of the wreath, and then I took that piece of jute, wrapped it around the top of the frame, tied it off in a knot, and then hot glued it down along the back side of the frame. Here is my USA framed rag wreath all finished. This again was such an easy project, and it goes perfect with my rustic themed patriotic decor. And now for the last DIY, I'll be making a stars sign. For this one, I used 2 11 3/4 by 5 by a 1/2 inch thick pieces of wood, 3 3-inch unfinished wood stars, and 1 2-inch unfinished wood star. Waverly chalk paint in plaster, folk art chalk paint in Tuscan red and also in the color nautical, paintbrushes, duct tape, a wax candle, cotton cord from Hobby Lobby, large popsicle sticks from Dollar Tree, and my hot glue gun. For this one, I started by painting my 2 pieces of wood with my plaster color chalk paint. I did only do 1 coat of paint for these, but since the wood was really rough, I did have to paint in a bunch of different directions just to get the paint deep into the wood. After the paint was dry on both of my boards, I then took this old wax candle and I started rubbing it around on both boards and on both sides of each board. I'm going to be giving this project a really chippy look, and this is going to help me achieve that. Next, I'm painting on my Tuscan red chalk paint on both of my boards over top of the wax that I just rubbed over both boards. And I did do 2 coats of this red paint. I wanted to have a little bit of a deeper red color, so that's why I did the 2 coats. After my paint had dried really well, I'm then applying some duct tape to my board, and I am going to be doing this on the front and back so I can have the chippy look on both the front and back of my project. Once I had the duct tape all pressed on really well, I'm then peeling it off, kind of like you would do a wax strip, and this is going to be taking that red colored paint off of everywhere that I've applied that candle wax. This is a really great way to achieve a chippy look. It's super easy. I've used it on a few different projects so far, and I really love this technique. I did do it on both of my boards. I then painted 2 of my 3-inch unfinished wood stars with my plaster color paint, and then I painted the 2-inch wood star with the plaster color paint as well. For my 3rd 3-inch wood star, I painted it with my nautical colored paint. I'm going to be using 3 of these large wood popsicle sticks to hold the 2 pieces of wood together and give them a little bit more stability. So I'm just cutting the popsicle sticks down so that they don't overlap the 2 pieces of wood. Once I have them all cut down, I'm then placing hot glue on one side of my board and then pressing the 2 boards together to hold them in place. And then, like I said, I wanted to use the popsicle sticks to hold the boards together a little bit better. So I placed hot glue along each popsicle stick and then just pressed each one down on the back of my boards. Next, I'm attaching my 2-inch white wood star to my blue 3-inch star. I've just placed hot glue right on the back side of the white star and pressed it in the center of the blue star. And then I'm attaching all 3 of my 3-inch stars in the center of my chippy pieces of wood. Again, just place hot glue on the back side of each star and then press them down in the center of my chippy pieces of wood. For the last step, I'm going to be creating my hanger, and I'm going to be using this cotton cord from Hobby Lobby. I'm cutting it down to size for how long I want my hanger to be, and then I'm going to be making a knot on each side of the cotton cord. And I do want these knots to be on the front side of my sign, so I'm placing the hot glue on the front side and then just pressing the knot down on the glue to attach them. And here is my hanging star sign all finished. This project could not have been easier, and I'm really loving that chippy paint technique. For the first DIY today, I'll be making a Star America sign. For this project, I used a star sign from Dollar Tree, star stencil from Amazon, wood letters that spell America from Hobby Lobby, a 10-inch by 1.5-inch piece of wood, Waverly chalk paint in plaster and also in ink, folk art chalk paint in Tuscan red, nautical, and also in Java, paintbrushes, painter's tape, jute, and my hot glue gun. To start this project, I flipped over my star sign from Dollar Tree and I'm removing the tag that's along the back side. I peeled off as much of it as I could, and then I'm just sanding off the rest of the sticky residue. I am going to be using the back of this sign as the front of mine. I'm then taking a piece of painter's tape and I'm taping off the bottom of the star. I'm then painting the top part of the star with my nautical colored chalk paint, and I did have to do 2 coats of this paint. Once the paint was all dry, I then peeled off that piece of painter's tape, and then for the bottom of the star, I'm placing a piece of painter's tape once again, but this time I'm going to be placing it right on the edge of where I just painted the blue color, and then I'm painting the bottom of the star with the Tuscan red chalk paint. I used the painter's tape so that I wouldn't get any of the red color on top of my blue, and I did do 2 coats of that red paint. Once it was dry, I peeled back the painter's tape, and then for this piece of wood that I'm using, it's 10 inches by 1.5 inches. I'm painting this one with that Tuscan red chalk paint as well, and I did 2 coats of that paint. Then for my wood letters that spell out the word America, I painted them with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I only did 1 coat of paint on each letter. Next, I'm using this star stencil that I got from Amazon to create all of the stars on the top portion of my sign. I'm placing the stencil wherever I think I want to put a star, and then I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush and my plaster color chalk paint to paint on the stars. And I just moved the stencil around in different spots where I thought a star would look good and just painted them on. My stars are not perfectly centered, but I ended up really liking how they turned out. You could always use the smaller stars too on the stencil if you wanted, but I just stuck with the larger size star. Now that I have all of my stars painted on, I'm placing a piece of painter's tape in the center of my star on the bottom. On that Tuscan red color I painted on, I'm going to be creating stripes. So after I placed on the first piece of tape in the center, I'm placing a second piece of tape next to that, which is going to be my spacer piece, and then a third piece of painter's tape next to the spacer piece, and then just peeled that off once I had my other 2 pieces of tape on, and then I continued that same step on the other side. And to make sure that I don't get any of my plaster color paint onto the blue paint that I've already painted on, I'm just placing some more painter's tape on top of that so that I don't have to do any extra painting later on to touch anything up. So in between all of the spaces of my painter's tape, I'm then painting on my white stripes, which are the Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did 2 coats of this paint. After all of that paint completely dried, I then peeled back all of the painter's tape. Next, I'm placing hot glue on the back side of the wood piece that I've already painted, and then I'm placing that wood piece right in the center of my star, and the top portion of the wood piece is going to overlap some of those stars. And then I'm taking a chip brush with my Java colored chalk paint, and I'm dry brushing that along the entire star, around all of the edges and the front. I want this to have a nice rustic look to it. If you didn't want to have a rustic look to your star, you could skip this step. After I had all of that Java colored painted on, I then decided I wanted to have some of the plaster color painted over top of the darker colors of my star. So again, I'm just placing some of that plaster colored chalk paint onto a chip brush and dry brushing that over top of all of my star. Then I'm placing all of my wood letters that spell America on the front of my wood piece that I have on my star. I'm just getting them all centered and into place before I start gluing them down. To glue them down, I'm placing hot glue on the back side of each letter and then just pressing the letter back into place. I'm then continuing that same step for all of my letters until I have them all attached to the front of my wood sign. For the last step, I'm taking a piece of jute and stringing it through the pre-drilled hole that was at the top of the star and then just tying that off in a knot to create my hanger. Here is my America star sign all finished. I love how this one turned out. It was super easy to create, and it is perfect for if you're into the rustic style like I am. Now moving into DIY number 2, I'm making a Happy 4th of July sign. For this one, I used a round sign from Dollar Tree, this Happy 4th of July stencil from Amazon, Waverly chalk paint in plaster and also in ink, folk art chalk paint in Imperial and in nautical, paintbrushes, burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, blue checked ribbon from Hobby Lobby, jute, and my hot glue gun. For this project, I'm using the back side of the sign, again, as the front of my sign. I'm peeling off that sticky tag that's along the back just as much as I can, and then just sanding off the rest of the sticky residue so that I have a nice clean surface to start painting. For the paint on my sign, I used the Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did do 2 different coats of this paint. Once the paint was all dry, I then took this Happy 4th of July stencil from Amazon that I will have linked down in the description box, and I placed it in the center of my circle and just measured it on each side to make sure that it was centered. I am leaving it a little bit spaced from the top of the circle so that I can place a bow on here later. I just taped everything down with some painter's tape so the stencil doesn't move around when I'm painting. And then for around the tires, which is going to be where I'm painting first, I'm placing painter's tape all around them so I don't get any of this ink color that I'm painting on onto the truck portion of my stencil. To paint this color on, I'm using a small paintbrush. I would have preferred to use a stencil brush, but I could not find mine during filming, so I just went with the paintbrush that was nearby. Then for all of the Happy 4th of July words on the bottom of the stencil, I'm also painting them in the Waverly chalk paint in the color ink. After that paint was dry, I then peeled off the painter's tape around all of the tires on the stencil, and then I'm going to be moving on to the truck portion of the stencil, and for that I'm using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Imperial, and I am taking another piece of painter's tape and placing it on the stars that were above the bed of the truck so that I don't get any of this red color onto the stars. And again, I just used a small paintbrush to apply all of the paint. I really wish I would have had a stencil brush for this. After that paint dried, I then peeled off the painter's tape from on top of the stars, and then I'm taking another piece of tape and I'm placing it over top of the bed of the truck and on the side of the truck where I've already painted it red, because I'm going to be painting the stars in this nautical color from Folk Art, but I didn't want to get any of the blue color onto the red. I'm kind of messy when I do stencils, so it really helps me to just use painter's tape. And then some of the tape did peel some of the red color off, so I just touched that up. And now that I have everything painted, I'm peeling off all of the tape from the sides and removing my stencil. Next, I'm attaching some nautical rope around the entire edge of my circle. I'm placing hot glue right on the edge and then just pushing the nautical rope over top of the glue to attach it. And I continued this step all the way around my circle, and then once I got to the very top, I just cut off the end of the nautical rope and then glued that end piece down with some hot glue. Next, I'm creating my bow. I'm using this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm cutting 3 different size pieces of this ribbon. The first piece I cut at 13 inches in length, the second piece I'm cutting at 10 inches in length, and then the third piece I'm cutting is 8 inches long. I'm then hot gluing the ends of each piece of ribbon together to form a circle, and I did this for all 3 of them, the large, medium, and small strips of ribbon. Once I had those all glued together, I then stacked them going from largest to smallest. I then gathered them all together in the center, and then I used a piece of jute and I tied that around the center, and I tied the knot of the jute on the back side. Then I'm cutting another piece of this burlap ribbon out. I'm cutting it down for however long I want the tail ends of my bow to be. I'm then gathering that piece of ribbon in the center and tying a piece of jute around the middle, just like I did with my bow. Once I have that all set, I'm then cutting a piece of this blue checked ribbon from Hobby Lobby, and I'm going to be just tying it around the burlap ribbon that I just cut in the center, just to add a little bit of color to my bow. Then I'm putting hot glue right in the center of those 2 pieces of ribbon and pressing on the bow that I've already created to attach everything together. I'm then placing hot glue on the front of my sign where I'm going to be putting my bow, and then I'm just placing the bow over the glue. And I did end up cutting my tail ends of my ribbon in a diagonal shape. And then I really didn't like how my bow looked, so I peeled the top of the bow off of the tail ends, and then I placed a piece of this blue checked ribbon around the center of my bow. I really love how much more color this added to my bow, and it just tied everything together. I then placed hot glue right in the center of the tail ends again, and then pressed my bow on top of that to attach them together. For the last step, I'm stringing a piece of jute through the pre-drilled hole to create my hanger. And this is my Happy 4th of July sign all finished. I'm so happy with how this one turned out. I really love this stencil that I got from Amazon. Again, I'll have those stencils that I used in today's video linked in the description box below. For DIY number 1, I'm making a red, white, and blue felt wreath. For this project, I used a 9-inch wreath form from Dollar Tree, 9 by 12-inch sheets of felt in the colors red, white, and blue, Waverly chalk paint and plaster, Folk Art chalk paint and castle, paintbrushes, this wire garland from Hobby Lobby, scissors, jute, and my hot glue gun. I first started by folding up one of my felt sheets, And here I'm using a 3-inch embroidery hoop to trace around because I need to create 3-inch circles. Now, I just had this embroidery hoop laying around and it just so happened to be 3 inches, so that's why I'm using it. But you can use anything that's a 3-inch circle to trace around, or you can just freehand your circle as well. Once I had it all traced, I then cut out my circle. And it did create 2 circles since I did fold the felt upward. I then used one of the circles that I just cut out as a guide to help me continue cutting out all of the red circles that I'll be using for my wreath. And for all of the red ones, I did use 5 9x12 sheets. I continued those same steps when cutting out all of my blue felt circles, only I used 6 of the 9x12 inch sheets of felt, and then for my white felt circles, I used 5 of the 9x12 inch sheets of felt. And I was able to get 6 circles out of each sheet of felt. Next, I'm creating my flowers to go on my wreath. I took one of my red circles and then I placed hot glue in the center and then folded it in half. I'm then placing hot glue in the center of that folded half and then folding it over again to create my flower shape. I then continued that same step on all of my red circles to create my red flowers. I then started attaching them to my wreath form. To attach them, I placed hot glue right on the wreath form and then pressed the flower on the glue and then just held that in place until the glue was dry. After I had a section of my red flowers attached, I then started forming all of my white flowers the same as I did the red ones. I placed hot glue in the center of one of the white circles, folded it in half, then placed hot glue in the center of the folded circle and folded it over again. And then I started attaching them the same way as I did the section of red flowers. I just placed hot glue on the wreath form and then pressed the flowers on the glue to attach them. I alternated between the red and the white flowers until I got a little more than halfway around my wreath form. I then started creating all of my blue flowers and then attaching those to my wreath form the same as I did the red and white flowers. And I continued attaching them until I had my wreath form completely covered with flowers. Next, I'm painting this metal flower that I got from Dollar Tree. It originally came on a wire stake and I just took the stake off. Though I did want to have the star all white, so I'm painting it with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did have to do 3 coats of paint on this. And because I wanted this star to have a little bit of a rustic look to it, I took my folk art chalk paint in the color Castle and I lightly painted that color around all of the edges of the star and then all of the raised parts of the star. Now I'm attaching some of this red, white, and blue wire garland that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. I'm attaching it to the back where the original wire stake was on the star. So I'm just tying it around that and then I'm wrapping the wire garland around my star randomly in places where I think it would look good until I have a bunch of it wrapped around the front. And then to make sure that it stays secure, I'm just taking the end of the wire garland and wrapping it around some of the other wires on the back side. To attach the star to my wreath, I'm taking a piece of jute and I'm stringing it through the wire garland on the back side of the star. I'm then taking that jute and wrapping it around the side of my wreath over top of the blue flowers and then just tying that jute around the back side of the wreath. Now, I didn't put any of my flowers on the back side of my wreath because I wanted it to sit flat against the wall, but you could add flowers on the back of your wreath if you wanted. Now for the very last step, I'm just adding a piece of jute on the very top of my wreath for a hanger. Here is my wreath all finished. I think it is so beautiful. I love how it turned out and it was super easy to make. Now moving into DIY number 2, I'm making a patriotic wall picture. For this one, I used this picture that I picked up from Dollar Tree, the 1776 stencil from Amazon, navy and white polka dot craft paper from Hobby Lobby, Waverly chalk paint in Plaster, folk art chalk paint in Imperial, Castle, and also in Java, paintbrushes, large popsicle sticks from Dollar Tree, white cotton cord, a glue stick, and my hot glue gun. For this one, I started by taking all of the backing off of my frame. Once I had that off, then I popped out this glass piece that was on the front. It's glued on, but it's not on there very well. It pops out very easily. I then painted the frame with my Waverly paint in the color Plaster. I did have to do 2 coats of this paint to get that dark color all covered up. Once that paint was dry, I then took an old chip brush and my Java colored paint and I dry brushed that over top of the Plaster color to give the frame a farmhouse rustic look. The picture that came in the Dollar Tree frame I do want to use, but I wanted to get the cardboard circle part off of the backing, so I used some scissors to pop it off, and then I peeled all of the excess glue off of the cardboard piece on the bottom. Then I started painting the circle with my Waverly paint and plaster, and then I decided, no, I don't want it white, I want it red. So then I started painting it with the folk art paint and Imperial, but you could still see some of that writing that was raised on this sign, and I didn't want you to be able to see the writing. So then I decided to glue some of these large popsicle sticks from Dollar Tree just right on the front of the circle. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm placing hot glue on the back side of each popsicle stick and then just layering them over top of the cardboard circle. After I have all of my sticks glued on the front, I'm then cutting off any of the ends that overlap the sides of the circle. And to do that, I'm just using some scissors and taking my time when cutting the sticks off. Next, I'm painting over all of those wood sticks with my folk art paint in the color Imperial, and I went over this twice with this color. Once that paint was all dry, I then took a chip brush with my Waverly paint in the color Plaster, and I dry brushed that around the entire circle. Now I'm placing this 1776 stencil right in the center of my circle. I did get this in a pack of stencils from Amazon, and the color that I'm using is the Waverly paint once again in the color Plaster, and I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush to apply the paint. After my paint has dried from the stencil, I'm then attaching some of this white cotton cord around the entire edge of my circle, and to do that I'm just placing hot glue around the edge of the circle and then placing the cotton cord over top. Once I got around to the very top, I cut off the cotton cord and then hot glued that end piece down. I was gonna leave it like this with just the one strand of cord going around, but then I decided it looked a little messy, so I just added another string of cotton cord around the first one that I just attached, and I did it the exact same way. To make the backing on my sign, I'm using this square cardboard piece that originally came in the picture from Dollar Tree, and then just tracing that onto my navy and white craft paper that I got from Hobby Lobby. Once I have it all traced out, I'm then cutting it down to size. Then to attach my navy and white polka dot paper onto my cardboard backing, I'm placing some hot glue on the entire cardboard piece and then just setting my navy and white polka dot paper over top. Next, I'm putting my frame back together, and instead of placing the glass piece on the front, I'm placing it on the back side of the frame. Then for the last step, I'm hot gluing my circle right in the center of my polka dot paper. Here is my 1776 picture all finished. I originally had different plans for it when I started, but I'm so happy with how it turned out. And now for DIY number 3, I'm making a stars wall decor piece. For this one, I used a 24" by 3.5" by 1/2 inch thick piece of wood, stars garland from Dollar Tree, burlap fabric, Craftsmart wood stain in brown, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, folk art chalk paint in nautical and also in Tuscan red, paintbrushes, scissors, D-ring hangers, and my hot glue gun. I first started by applying my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown to my wood piece, and to do that I'm just using an old towel. I did go over the entire piece of wood. I did the sides, the front, and the back side, and I only did one coat on this wood piece. Once the stain completely dried, I then took a chip brush and my Waverly paint in the color plaster, and I dry brushed that over top of the entire wood piece. Some places I added more paint than others because I wanted it to have kind of like a rustic, chippy paint effect. Next, I'm taking apart this star banner that I picked up from Dollar Tree. I'm just peeling back the burlap that held all 3 stars together and then picking off any of the excess glue that was still on the stars. And because I had a little bit of like residue on each star, I just took a piece of sandpaper and lightly sanded over all of those areas on all 3 stars. The first star I painted with my Waverly paint in the color plaster, and I did 2 coats of paint on this star. The second star I painted with my folk art paint in the color Tuscan red, and I did 2 coats on this one. And then the third star I painted with the folk art paint in the color nautical, and I did 2 coats on this star as well. Once the paint dried on all 3 stars, on the blue star I took a chip brush and that plaster colored paint and I dry brushed this color around all of the edges of the star and then on the front of the star as well. And then for the red star I did the same thing. I painted this white color on the front and all of the sides. For the white star I took my folk art chalk paint in the color Castle and I dry brushed that again on all of the sides and then on the front of the star. I then started assembling my wall piece. I put my stars going red, white, and blue vertically down my wood piece. I then took my measuring tape and just made sure that my top and bottom stars were at 2 1/4 from the very edge of my wood, and then I just hot glued each star down. I placed the hot glue right on the back side of the star and then just pressed it on my wood piece. To add some more detail, I'm using some of this burlap fabric. Here I'm cutting it down to size so that I can have it wrapping around the very top of my wood piece right above my red star, and then I'm cutting a second piece of burlap to go around the bottom of my wood piece right below my blue star. I wanted both strips of this burlap fabric to be frayed on both sides, so here I'm just taking some of the little burlap pieces and pulling them back so that all of my sides are nice and frayed. I'm then using some hot glue to attach those burlap strips around the very top of my wood piece and the bottom of my wood piece. And I wanted to add even more detail, so here I'm cutting a piece of cotton cord and I'm putting it in the center of the burlap strip on the bottom, and I'm just hot gluing the 2 ends of that cotton cord on the back side, and then I'm doing the same thing for another strip of this white cotton cord on the top part of my wood piece. You could leave your decorative piece just like this, but I wanted to add a hanger to the back of mine, so here I'm adding a D-hook hanger that I picked up from Walmart, just placing it right in the center on the back of my wood piece and just screwing it into place. Here is my stars wall piece all finished. I love how rustic this one is, and I ended up just setting it on one of my tables instead of hanging it on my wall, but I love that I have the option to do both. For DIY number 1, I'm going to be making a framed flag. For this project, I used a 4x6 canvas from Dollar Tree, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, folk art chalk paint in imperial, nautical, and also in the color Java, paint brushes, Craftsmart wood stain in brown, a utility knife, large popsicle sticks from Dollar Tree, star beads from Dollar Tree, and my hot glue gun. For this one, I started by cutting the canvas off of its frame using a utility knife. This utility knife that I'm using here is pretty dull, so I did have to go over the areas several times to be able to get it to cut through the canvas all the way. So if you're going to be doing this, make sure that you use a nice sharp knife. Once I had it all the way cut around, I just started pulling the canvas off of its frame, and then I did use some scissors to help me out in any of the areas that I missed. Because I didn't want to pull all of the staples out of the back side of the frame, I ended up just pulling the canvas through the staples. And since you're not going to see the back, I really wasn't worried about it too much. Once I had the canvas off, I then went in with my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown in an old towel and just wiped that around the entire frame to give it a nice stained look. I really love this stain. I've been using it in multiple videos and I cannot recommend it more. Next, I'm painting 2 of these large popsicle sticks with the imperial colored paint, only I'm painting just half of the popsicle sticks with this color, and to get a nice precise line I'm using a really small paintbrush because I'm going to be doing the other side of the popsicle stick with a different color, and I just placed both of the sticks like side by side next to each other so that I could get the lines exactly in the same place since they will be glued next to each other. Then I painted half of one of the large popsicle sticks with my plastered colored chalk paint, and again just lined it up with the other popsicle sticks that I had painted half with the red color so that all of the lines match up perfectly. Then I'm painting 1 whole popsicle stick with my plastered colored paint and then 1 whole popsicle stick with my imperial colored paint. Now for the stick that was painted half with the plaster color, I'm painting the other half of that stick with the nautical colored paint. Then for the sticks that were painted half with the imperial color, I'm painting the other half of those with that nautical color as well. Next, I'm painting 6 of these mini star beads from Dollar Tree with my plastered colored chalk paint, and I'm using a really small paintbrush since the stars are so tiny. Now that I have everything all painted, I'm going to be assembling everything together. I'm placing hot glue on the back side of my wood frame, and the first stick I'm putting down, it's the red and blue one. Underneath the red and blue stick, I'm applying the one with the white and blue. And then after I have that one attached, I'm applying another red and blue one. You just want to make sure that all of your colors match up on the front. And then underneath that one, I'm applying the fully painted white stick. And then underneath the fully painted white one, I'm doing the fully painted red one. Since I want this piece to look aged and rustic, I'm applying some of my Java colored paint to a chip brush and just dry brushing that color over top of everything. And for the very last step, I'm applying a very small amount of hot glue on the back side of my painted stars, and then I'm attaching those stars to the blue painted popsicle sticks to have a total of 6 stars. Here is my flag sign all finished. I love how this one turned out. It was super easy to make, and what's even better is I created it using almost all Dollar Tree materials. Now moving into DIY number 2, I'll be making a firework stand sign. For this one, I used a tag-shaped sign that I picked up from Dollar Tree, a printed image that I created on my computer and printed onto wax paper, burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, cotton cord from Michaels, Waverly chalk paint and plaster, folk art chalk paint and Java, paintbrushes, jute, and my hot glue gun. I'm going to be using the back of this Dollar Tree sign as the front of my sign. No surprise there, I do that a lot in my videos, but I still really wanted to use these cute stars that were on the sign, so I'm just taking a butter knife and peeling them off. I wasn't worried about messing up this sign because you're really not going to see it anyway, but if you are worried about it, you could always sand over those areas and then just paint over them. I then flipped the sign over and started painting it with the Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. I did do 2 coats of this paint to get everything covered up really nicely. Once that paint had completely dried, I then took a chip brush and my Java colored paint and I dry brushed that around all of the edges and then the front of the sign as well. I tried to stay going in the same motions up and down when I was doing the front of the sign. Next, I'm laying down my printed image on wax paper right in the center of my sign. Then I'm using an old card to press all of that ink down onto the front of my sign. Once I have it all pressed down with the card, I'm then using the end of a paintbrush to go over each and every letter to make sure that that ink is pressed down into the front of the sign really, really well. You want to make sure that you don't move the wax paper around at all because it will smudge that ink. I do have a link to this image in the description box below in case you guys want to use this image for any of your upcoming projects. After that ink is all pressed in, I then just simply peel off the wax paper. I'm now cutting down a piece of this burlap ribbon so that it will fit along the very front of my sign. And yes, I'm using my son's kid scissors because during crafting, for some reason, I always lose things and I could not find my scissors, so I just grabbed his. And to make the burlap ribbon a little bit thinner, I just cut off the 2 sides. Then I'm attaching the 2 ends of the ribbon along the back side of the sign using some hot glue. Next, I'm dry brushing some of this Java colored paint on top of the 3 stars that I popped off the front of the sign in the beginning of the video. Once I had the Java colored on, then I decided to paint some of my plastered color paint on all 3 stars. And then just for a little pop of color, I dry brushed my nautical color paint on the stars as well. I was going to leave the burlap ribbon as is, but then decided a piece of this cotton cord would be really cute centered over top of it. So I just cut that piece down to size and then I'm hot gluing the ends of the cotton cord along the back side of the sign. Next, I'm attaching all 3 of my stars. I placed hot glue along the back side of each star and then pressed them down over top of the cotton cord. Now they are not going to sit exactly flat on the cotton cord, but that doesn't really bother me. To add a little bit more detail to my sign, I'm adding some jute around the hole that was already in the sign originally. And to do that, I'm placing hot glue on the actual sign and then just sticking down the jute over top in a circle. And I went around it 3 different times and then just cut off the excess jute and glued the end piece down. And for the last step, I took 2 pieces of jute, strung them through the hole of the sign, and then made a knot on the ends of those pieces of jute. This is the fireworks stand sign all finished. I love the rustic look of this, and again, I was able to create it using almost all Dollar Tree products. Now for the third and final DIY for today, I'll be making a USA sign. For this one, I used a USA sign from Dollar Tree. I also used these USA banner sign from Dollar Tree. Dowel rods, 2 of them at 12 inches and 2 of them at 6.5 inches long. Waverly chalk paint and plaster. Folk art chalk paint in Imperial, Nautical, and also in the color Java. Paintbrushes. Craftsmart wood stain in brown. Painter's tape. Cotton cord. Sandpaper. A utility knife. And my hot glue gun. For this project, I started by cutting off the jute hanger that was already originally on the sign, and then since again I'm using the back side of the sign for the front of my sign, I peeled off that sticker and then just sanded off any of that sticky residue until I had a nice clean surface. I'm going to need to cut off some of my sign so that it will fit the size of my dowel rods. So I'm holding the 12-inch rod at the top where I want to cut all of the excess off, and I just marked that with a pen. Then I'm holding the 6.5-inch rod on the side, marking off exactly where I'm going to want to cut all of that excess off. To cut it off, I'm going to be using a utility knife. I'm just holding a ruler right on the line so that I can stay in place and not move around when I'm cutting with my utility knife. I feel that that helps me stay in a straight line. And once I had the board cut almost all the way through, I then bended the board back and forth. And then because it had more of a paper on the front, I just flipped the sign over and cut that off. And then used my utility knife to cut any of the rough edges that were still left over. It's best to make sure that you're using a really sharp knife. Again, mine was pretty dull, so some of my cuts could have been a little bit better. And then I'm just continuing that step for the other part that I marked off that I needed to cut. I'm just using my utility knife, cutting off in that line that I'd already marked, bending it back and forth once it's almost cut all the way through, and then just cutting off any of the excess paper that was on the front. Next, I'm painting the entire front side of my sign with my folk art chalk paint in the color Imperial, and I did only have to do 1 coat of this paint. Once that paint has completely dried, I then took a chip brush and my plaster color chalk paint and dry brushed that over top of my sign to give it a rustic look. Next, I'm applying my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown over top of all 4 of my dowels, and to apply it, I used an old towel and I only had to go over them 1 time with the stain. Now I'm taking apart this USA banner that I picked up from Dollar Tree. I just cut the burlap off and then peeled it off of each letter. It was attached with some glue and it really wasn't on there very good, so I was able to just peel all that glue and burlap off really quickly. For the letter U, I'm able to just flip it over and use the back side instead of trying to get all of that glitter off of the front, but I did take some sandpaper and go over all of the edges of the U because they were a little rough. Now, for the S and the A, obviously I can't just flip them over because it changes the way that the letters go. So I'm using some sandpaper to sand all of the glitter that's on the letters off. I was going to use Goo Gone, but I'm not sure what I did with mine, so I just used some sandpaper. If you do have Goo Gone, it is going to work a lot better than having to sand off all of the glitter. And I sanded off all of the glitter on the letter A as well. For the letter U, I'm painting it with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did do 2 coats of this paint. Then for the letter S, I still wanted to have the stripes that were originally on it, so I used some painter's tape to mark off where I'm going to be painting my stripes. And then I painted the Imperial color in between all of the pieces of tape. But when I was pulling the tape off, it started to peel some of the backing that was originally on the S. And it actually started coming up really, really easy. So I just finished peeling it off, sanded anything that I couldn't peel off so that the letter was completely blank. Now that I have the surface all cleaned up again, I can start over. I'm placing a piece of painter's tape right in the center of the S and then placing 2 other pieces on each side of that center piece. And then I'm painting the red color in all of the open spaces. After the paint was all dry, I then peeled off the tape, and as you can see here, some of the backing still peeled off. So I had to touch up the paint a little bit with that same color paint. I don't recommend using these Dollar Tree letters if you are going to be repainting them. If you're not going to repaint them, then that's fine, but if you are, I would just recommend getting some from your local craft store or Walmart to use. In the open spaces between all of the red color, I then painted those with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. And to make sure I get nice precise lines against the red paint, I used a really small paintbrush. Now I'm moving on to my letter A, and I'm painting one coat of this nautical colored chalk paint over top. And to stick with the rustic farmhouse look that I have going on all three of my projects today, I'm using some of my Java color chalk paint and my Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I'm dry brushing that color over top of all of my letters, mainly focusing on the ones that have the white. And then for the S that has the red color on it, I'm using a chip brush and that plaster color paint and painting over all of the red areas. And then on my A that's painted blue, I'm painting some of this plaster color paint once again over top of it, mainly focusing around the edges, and it's going to give it almost like it has a chipped paint effect. Next, it's time to assemble my sign. I'm placing hot glue on the back of one of my 6.5-inch dowel rods and placing it on the side of my sign. Then I'm doing the same thing with the 12-inch rod, only I'm placing it on the top side, and then just continuing that step for the other side dowel rod and then the bottom dowel rod. I'm then placing my letters USA right in the center of my sign and just getting them exactly where I want them before I start gluing them down. I'm placing hot glue on the back side of each letter and then just pressing them back into place. I really didn't like the space between my dowel rods and the side of my sign. I did not like the way that that looked, and I wanted to cover it up. So I'm using some of this cotton cord. I just measured it around each side of the sign, cut it down, and then hot glued it onto the side of my sign. I really ended up loving the way that the cotton cord looked next to the dowel rods. I originally hadn't planned for it to be there, but then again, most of my DIYs never go as planned. And then for the hanger, I'm using 2 pieces of this cotton cord. Once again, I just cut those 2 pieces down to the size that I wanted my hanger to be. And then I hot glued each end of the cotton cord down on the back side of my sign. Here is my USA sign all finished. This one gave me a little bit of trouble, but I really love how it turned out. If you're going to be using this sign outside, be sure to give it a couple coats of protectant sealant. The first DIY is the lanterns, and I'll be using these glass jars, some jute, Mod Podge, small American flags, a sponge paintbrush, battery operated tea lights, and some scissors. I'm first starting out by taking the poles off of the flag, and then I'm going to be cutting off the part where the pole was inserted so that my flag will lay better on my glass. When you're cutting your flag, you want to cut as close to the seam as you possibly can. You don't want to cut half of the stars off because your flag won't look right. Removing the lids to my jars because I will not be using them for this project, and then I'm going to be painting on a thin layer of Mod Podge with my sponge paintbrush on the back side of my flag, and then I'll be placing it on the side of my glass jar. You want to make sure that you're getting the Mod Podge on the very edges of the flag so that your edges don't pop off once you place them on the glass. Now that I have my Mod Podge applied to my flag, I'm going to be placing it on the side of the glass jar and then rubbing out any bubbles with my fingers. This size flag would work well with a little bit larger of a jar, but these jars are ones that I already had at home, and I just figured I would go ahead and use them for this project. Now I'm painting Mod Podge to my second flag the same as I did the first one. I'm applying it with my sponge brush all over the back of the flag and concentrating on the edges so that my edges don't pop up off of the glass. And again, applying my flag to my glass jar and then pushing out any bubbles with my fingers. After my Mod Podge has dried, I'm now taking another layer of Mod Podge and I'm painting it with my sponge paintbrush on top of the flag. And if you get any excess Mod Podge on your glass, you can just take a wet paper towel like I'm going to be doing here in just a second and wiping off any that's on the glass jar. And if it does dry, you don't have to worry about it because you can just take some nail polish remover to get that off. It works great. And I'm doing that same step here on the second jar. Now I'm going to be using some jute to wrap around the tops of my jars. I'm cutting off a long piece and then wrapping it around the tops of the jars 2 to 3 times before I tie it off and then cut off the excess jute pieces. The last step is to take your tea lights and just place them in the bottom of the jars. If you are using real candles, I would probably put some sand or something on the bottom of the jar if it has a bump so that your candle will sit even. Moving into DIY number 2, I'll be using these wooden blocks and stars from Hobby Lobby, some jute, a paintbrush, my hot glue gun, sandpaper, and I'll also be using some of this chalkboard paint from Martha Stewart in the color Ink, the Waverly Inspirations chalk paint in the color Ivory and Truffle. I'll also be using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Tuscan Red. To start out, I'm going to be taking this Waverly Inspirations chalk paint in the color Truffle, and I'm painting all of my wooden blocks in this color on all sides. I wanted my blocks to have a rustic look to them, so I'm doing a layered paint effect. That's why I'm painting this brown on first before I paint the other colors over top. While my blocks are drying, I'm going to be painting the 3 small stars that are in this pack with red, white, and blue. I'm going to be using that Martha Stewart chalkboard paint in the color Ink. I didn't realize that this was chalkboard paint. I thought it was chalk paint, and I got home and realized it was the chalkboard paint, but I decided to use it anyway and it worked out fine. And then I'm painting the white color with the Waverly Inspirations chalk paint in the color Ivory, and the red I'm painting with the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Tuscan Red, but I'm going to be mixing in some of this Waverly Inspirations paint in the color Truffle because the red was a little bright and I wanted it to be more of a rustic red. Now that my brown color is all dry on my blocks, I'm going to be painting them in red, white, and blue. One of them I'm painting all in red, one I'm painting all in blue, and one I'm painting all in white. After my blocks have all dried in the red, white, and blue, I'm going to be taking this 120 grit sandpaper. You can use any grit sandpaper that you want. This is just one that I already have here at home. And I'm going to be sanding around the edges of the blocks and on the sides of the blocks. It's going to make that brown color that we painted in the beginning peek through, as well as some of that natural wood finish that the blocks originally were. And it's going to give your blocks a really nice rustic look. After I have my blocks all sanded, I'm now going to be adding on my red, white, and blue stars. And I'm going to be doing this with my hot glue gun by taking some hot glue, placing it on the back of the star, and then pressing it on the block. I'm going to be repeating this step on all of my blocks. I decided not to do the layered effect with the paint on my stars, but you could if you wanted to. Next, I'm going to be using this jute to wrap around each one of my blocks. I'm going to be taking the smallest amount of hot glue and then pressing down on the jute to attach it to the back of the block. And then I'm going to be wrapping the jute around 3 times before I tie off a bow in the very front of the star. Once I get my bow the way I want it to, I'm cutting off the excess jute. And then I'm repeating this step for each one of my blocks. And that is it for this DIY. What I love about these blocks is you can switch them up by stacking them in a bunch of different ways. To make my wreath, I'm using a wreath form, some patriotic stems, burlap ribbon, jute, and my hot glue gun. I'm starting out by taking my burlap ribbon off of its roll. I knew it was going to be a lot easier to wrap the ribbon around the wreath form without it being on the cardboard roll. And then I'm going to be placing some hot glue on my wreath form and then putting the burlap on top of the hot glue to attach it to the wreath form. Now that I have the end of my ribbon attached to my wreath form, I'm going to start wrapping the ribbon around the form over and over again, and I'm going to be pulling the ribbon really tight so that I don't have any gaps between the wreath form and the ribbon. Each time I wrap over, I'm overlapping my ribbon by about 1/2 inch. Now I've come to the end of my ribbon roll and I'm going to be attaching this end piece with some hot glue, and then I'm going to be starting a new ribbon roll and I'm going to be attaching the end just like I did in the beginning with some hot glue, only this time I'm going to be placing the hot glue on top of the ribbon that's already attached to the wreath form, and then I'm going to start wrapping once again. You want to wrap your ribbon once around where you just hot glued your ribbon on so that you don't see any seams. And once you get to the very end, after you've wrapped your entire wreath form, you're going to cut off the end piece and hot glue it on. Now that I have my wreath form all covered in the burlap ribbon, I'm going to be using some of these 4th of July stems that I picked up from Hobby Lobby, and I'm going to be decorating my wreath. I'm taking apart some of the stems and peeling off these stars so that I'm able to hot glue them onto my wreath. I'm going to be using some jute to attach my stems to my wreath, and I'm just going to be wrapping the jute around the stem in the wreath form like 3 or 4 times and then tying it off in a knot so that my stems are attached. I'm not worried about how the jute looks being wrapped around the wreath because I'm going to be hot gluing one of these stars over top of the jute. I wanted to add a few more of these stems in, so I'm just sticking them down in between the jute and the wreath. Now I'm going to be adding the stars onto my wreath, and I'm going to be using my hot glue gun to do that. I'm just placing some hot glue onto the wreath and then pushing my star over top of the hot glue and holding it for just a second until the stars are completely attached. I'm taking my stars off of their stems by just peeling them right off. I first started cutting them off with my pliers and then realized that they just pull right off. And then I'm just placing my stars on top of my wreath to see where I want to hot glue them on. And then I'm hot gluing them on by placing some hot glue onto the star and then placing it on top of my wreath. And I did overlap a few of the stars because I liked the way that that looked. I'm continuing this step until all of my stars are glued onto my wreath. And that is the last step for this DIY 4th of July wreath. And that wraps up all 15 of my Patriotic Decor DIYs. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. And I would love it if you would subscribe if you're not subscribed already. Thank you so much for watching.